Hello and welcome to the History of the Metacrisis. Today I have the great pleasure and being honored of hosting William Rees, Dr. William Rees, who is a bioecologist, ecological economist, former director and professor emeritus at the University of British Columbia School of Community and Regional Planning. His early research focused on environmental assessment, but gradually extended to the biophysical requirements for sustainability and the implications of global ecological trends. Along the way, he developed a special interest in modern cities as dissipative structures and therefore as particularly vulnerable components of the total human ecosystem. Dr. Rees is perhaps best known as the originator and co-developer with his graduate students of ecological footprint analysis. The expanding human eco-footprint is arguably the world's best known indicator of the unsustainability of techno-industrial society. His book on eco-footprint, ecological footprint, co-authored with his former PhD student Mathis Warkernagel, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, has been published in 8 languages, including Chinese. Dr. Rees is also author of over 150 peer-reviewed papers and numerous popular articles on sustainability science and policy, and sometimes the lack of policy. His recent writing focuses on biological, neurocognitive, and socially constructed barriers to progress. Professor Rees' academic work has been widely recognized. He has served on numerous advisory committees and lectured by invitation in 30 countries. Dr. Rees is a founding member and former president of the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics, a founding director of the One Earth Initiative, and a fellow of the Post-Carbon Institute. He was elected to the Royal Society of Canada in 2006, and in 2007 was awarded the prestigious Trudeau Foundation Fellowship. In 2012, Professor Rees received an honorary doctorate from Laval University, the Boulding Prize in Ecological Economics, and a Blue Planet Prize, jointly with Dr. Warkernagel. He was elected the full member of the Club of Rome in 2014. So, without further ado, please welcome with me Dr. William Rees. Doctor, welcome to the History of the Metacrisis.
Thank you very much, Alexandros. My pleasure.
You are based in Canada.
I am. I'm in Vancouver on the extreme west coast of Canada.
And how is the weather there?
Right now, it's pretty normal, but we've been fluctuating from much below normal to much above normal. So today it's about 8-10 degrees and raining, which is fairly decent for this time of year. But by the end of the week, we're going up to 16-17 degrees and sunny, which is 7 or 8 degrees above normal. Last week, it was 7 or 8 degrees below normal. So we're seeing
big fluctuations.
Absolutely, and that's part of the climate change conundrum, more extreme weather. Australia this week is all, virtually the whole country is above 37 degrees or something, so it's insane.
Yes, it has already hit, Australia has already hit 52 degrees 3 weeks ago. Yeah, it is burning. But before diving into the ecological footprint and overshoot analysis, tell us a little bit about you. Where did you study? How did you come to develop this kind of questions in your mind? And then to come up with really groundbreaking terminology, because you have created the whole discussion about overshoot and footprint.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an old story. I was very fortunate as a young man. I'm 80 years old, so I grew up in the 40s and 50s.
You are 80?
I am indeed.
It doesn't seem so.
Well, I'm glad you think so. I like to hope so myself. At any rate, I was a farm boy in the 1940s and 1950s in southern Ontario on a general purpose farm that was essentially self-sufficient. And I learned to have a deep appreciation for the fact that we're attached to the earth. Everything on my plate, every meal, I had a hand in growing. So the vegetables I had watered or I had fertilized or I had picked. The beef I had helped to raise. I'd milked the cows. I'd, collected eggs from the chickens. So one develops with that rural experience a profound sense of connectedness to the land. So when I aged a little bit and went on to university, it was just natural for me to study human ecology, or at least ecology, which are the relationships between organisms and the biophysical environment. And by this time, the environmental movement had started. So we began to hear more and more about the hazards of pesticides and oil spills and so on and so forth. So it just propelled me along a path of trying to understand the relationship between human beings and the biophysical environment that contains us. And part of this was recognition that many of the symptoms we were seeing of pollution and overuse of resources was the result of excess numbers of people using too many of nature's bounty, or too much of nature's bounty. And I read a book in 1984, I think it was, called Overshoot, which really brought this into focus. And by this time, I'd already been developing a little tool. I began to argue with myself, based on my experience as a farm kid. If it was true that everything on my plate I had helped to grow, the question arises, and I think this is the first question of human ecology: just how much of the Earth's surface is needed to support me in whatever lifestyle it is that I am accustomed to? So if you think of all of our consumer goods, all of our food, our clothing, and all of these things, they all come from the earth at some point. If you have wool jacket, your jacket was based on wool from sheep, which used a certain amount of land to produce that wool, and so on. So to make a long story short, if we trace the annual consumption of an individual back to the landscape, we can then convert that person's consumption into the area of land needed to produce all of those goods and services. There's a big component needed to assimilate the waste products as well. And so I began to develop a method to calculate what each person's ecological footprint would be, how much of the land is needed to support just me. And of course, it varies enormously. If you're a peasant living in the Andes of South America, for example, you use very little energy, very little material. So you have a very tiny footprint. But if you're a European or a North American, especially North American, you have an enormous footprint, up to 7 or 8 global average hectares per on a continuous basis. So this was the development, the basis for ecological footprint analysis. And what we're able to show is that the total use of Earth made by human beings now at average material standards, just the average person is using almost twice as much of the Earth's surface as is actually available. So we're not living any longer on the annual production of the Earth. We're drawing down the accumulated biomass. So we're destroying the soils. We're bringing down the fish stocks. We're overexploiting virtually every resource that we're using. And so we are in a state of extended overshoot. So Overshoot was the idea Bill Catton started with his book called Overshoot, but we quantified it using ecological footprint analysis through the 80s and 90s and right up to the present day. It's still a major growing concern. And what we're able to show is then that we're in a state of overshoot, which we define as a situation in which human beings are using more of even renewable and replenishable resources than nature can reestablish or regenerate. And we're dumping vastly more wastes back into the system than natural systems can assimilate. And so we see the accumulation of waste products. How many people think of climate change as a waste management problem? Because the anthropogenic, or the human-caused part of climate change, is a result of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly carbon dioxide. But carbon dioxide is the principal waste product by weight of every major industrial economy. So it's just an example of how human consumption of resources is overloading the natural assimilative capacities of Earth. The total amount of photosynthesis by green plants is no longer capable of taking up all the carbon we're ejecting into the atmosphere. So it's accumulating in the atmosphere, causing climate change. Similarly, biodiversity loss. Human beings have displaced most of the other mammalian biomass from Earth. If you go back just 10,000 years at the dawn of agriculture, human beings were less than 1% of mammalian biomass, much less. Today, we're about 32%. But if you add our domestic livestock, the cattle, sheep, all of this, they're another 60% or more. So together, humans plus their domestic livestock are something like 97% of the biomass of mammals on Earth. All the other mammals have been displaced and are now living on the margins, only 3%. So the growth of the human enterprise is shrinking nature and consuming useful resources and replacing it with toxic waste, including such things as carbon dioxide. That is overshoot. And the bottom line is this, Alexandros. Overshoot is a terminal condition. If you stay in a state of overshoot, you are self-destroying. The system will collapse. So
overshoot is a kind of overdose.
It is an overdose. It's a terminal cancer, in a sense. Or if
let me ask you this. You are transmitting this message, and this has been adopted by the most educated people of the world. The whole political class and economic leaders know the terminology, they know the problems, and it's almost 4 decades now, 3.5 decades. What is wrong with people, and we cannot really address this very problem?
Well, that's a huge question, and there are very many answers to it, obviously. Well, look, for one thing, we have to recognize that we have an enormous vested interest, a huge investment in maintaining the present system. Very powerful people want to protect the existing system because it's the source of their wealth and political power. And so they resist any knowledge that would cause us to dramatically change our way of being. I think that's an enormously important question. Plus, most ordinary people have no understanding of the issues that we're talking about. So there's no popular support for the notion of overshoot. I suspect if you asked 100 people on the streets of Athens this morning what about overshoot, they wouldn't know what you're talking about. And that would be
the second is a result of the former.
In some sense, that's absolutely correct. And of course, we have the international mainstream media, which absolutely avoid discussion of overshoot or overpopulation or any major issue that would upset the political forces that really support them. So we have, I suppose, a cultural shield, a kind of intellectual or mental shield against information that goes against our current way of being, especially in the rich countries where we are happy and comfortable. If we were to recognize seriously the nature of overshoot, we would have to acknowledge that to confront overshoot requires an absolute reduction in energy and material consumption, and a major change in the scale of the economy and a reduction of our material standard of life. And that's simply not something that the mainstream is willing to contemplate. Another huge problem, and again, it's part of our cultural problem, is that overshoot, as I say, involves too many people consuming too much. Now, you can solve overshoot in theory by reducing total consumption. But if you reduce total consumption without touching population, you'll have too many people living on a rather unsatisfactory material standard of living. So it would be better also to reduce populations by several billion people, which would enable a few billion, or maybe 1 or 2 billion, to live comfortably on the earth indefinitely. But we have a cultural taboo against discussing the population issue. So several of the world's religions, including Catholicism, essentially prohibit discussion of the question of population planning. The United States, for example, refuses to fund agencies that disperse birth control. So it's all over the map. My own province in Canada now makes birth control freely available to anyone who wants it through the public healthcare system. So that's one end of the spectrum, but most of the planet is in denial about the population issue. There's another very major problem here, and it goes to human cognitive capacities. What neurosciences shows us is that when we get into a habitual state, if you have repeated experiences of something, or are exposed repeatedly to the same ideas, or repeatedly think through the same kinds of problems, it literally helps to shape synaptic circuits in the brain. It shapes neural networks in our brains. So once a particular pattern of thinking or experience of life is in place in the brain, it tends to cause people to seek out experiences that reinforce their pre-existing beliefs. We seek out people that are comparable to us or similar to us and who also reinforce our way of thinking. And we deny or forget or just ignore any contrary information. So even our neurology, our cognitive abilities are against accepting things that would cause us or would force us to have a major change in our lifestyles. So look at that. We have vested interests in opposition. We have religious beliefs in opposition. We have general ignorance in the population. We have a media, global media that are really in denial about the whole problem. So there's no chance of educating the people. And for the most part, people aren't open to new ideas anyway, because they're comfortable, at least in Western high-income countries, with their lifestyles and ways of thinking, and the profound belief that capitalism or growth-bound economics is the way to go. And the recent story is that we can, don't worry about climate change, for example, because we're going to see wind and solar energy displace fossil fuels and everything will be just as before. I call this business as usual by alternative means, but it's a complete myth. It's another what we call social construct. We make up a story that makes us feel good, because if we can find a substitute for fossil fuel, then we don't have to change our way of life. That makes us feel good. And it feeds right into this idea that we're simply seeking out solutions that reinforce the way we already are. And therefore, we don't have to really confront reality. Reality will
prevail.
Prevail eventually, yes.
Yes, no. Some weeks ago, I was speaking with your colleague, Richard Heinberg, and we were discussing the same thing, because even discussing the cost of energy transition to green technologies, right now it seems out of the agenda. The real costs in resources, in energy, of transitioning to a sustainable economy are huge. So we're going to overshoot even more, creating a huge impact to climate, to the biosphere, to the soil. We don't really have answers to resolving this kind of big questions, but we don't even discuss them.
You're absolutely right. And you pointed out a perfect example of what I've been saying. So the so-called energy transition, frankly, if one goes online and just researches this for a few minutes, you'll think that we're already there. You'll see several articles will say that 100% renewable green energy by 2050 is clearly possible. We just have to get on with it. Well, the reality is this isn't happening. The year for which we have the most recent complete data is 2022. And in that year, wind and solar, where I think something like 94% of all new investment is going, provided 2.7% of the world's final energy consumption. So it's barely underway. And yet we have this impression, this great wave of new energy is coming. Well, it isn't. And as you pointed out, it required all of the new technologies, wind turbines, solar panels, even looking for green hydrogen, but EVs and non-existent carbon extraction technologies. All of these things are fossil fuel dependent. They require an enormous build-out of infrastructure and a complete replacement of all the technologies that currently use fossil fuels. And by the way, all of that is going to require more use of fossil fuels. So we simply dig the hole deeper by creating cognitive illusions. We live in stories. Human beings are unique. Other animals take life as it comes. But humans make up stories about reality, and then we live in our stories as if they were real. And very often they clash with the biophysical reality. So we love our stories because they're much more comfortable than reality. But
And as
in
you
the end,
mentioned earlier, also our biological infrastructure, the very nature of the humankind, pushes to be like that.
absolutely.
The more we think about the stories, the harder the neurons and the harder the synapses are getting. They are
That's
getting it's a myelination is the terminology the cognitive sciences are using. So it's getting more hardwired into us. So
absolutely.
how can we come out of this conundrum? What is your ideas? Yes, okay, we identify the problems. We see a lot of different responses. Well, at the one end, we have techno-optimists that believe that AI right now is going to solve all our problems, while they tend to not to focus on the energy needs of AI, which are huge in water, in electricity. And on the other hand, you have the doomers, the pessimists. Okay, we are going to hell. We are already off the cliff. Nobody's going to save us. I believe that this is a spectrum. We can really predict the future. But what should we do in order to create better chances for a positive future?
Well, again, this is the huge question of the day.
This is why we are in a Metacrisis podcast.
Of course it is. All right. So most people will talk about what we should do. This is what we must do. So you must be familiar in Europe with the degrowth movement. We must downsize the economy and redistribute existing wealth and income so that there's a much more equitable distribution of the benefits of growth to society. So we're going to shrink while sharing. Well, how? That's what we might do. But how do you convince people that that's the way that we go? How do we convince governments? How many governments do you know have voluntarily said to their people, we're going to shrink the economy to 50% of its present size. And by the way, that means taxing you all to the point where we have to redistribute all of your income to your poorer neighbors. That's not exactly a political platform that has wings, because people don't understand the necessity of doing that kind of thing. So we are fixated on the how problem. All we have to do, you will read over and over again, is change our material expectations, change our lifestyle, learn to live more simply. But again, I ask, how? That's the what. But how do you get people to accept that kind of vision, particularly since a good half of the world's people don't yet have what they would regard as a sufficiently endowed material lifestyle?
Is it a matter of information, of education, of training, of retraining?
No, I think there's a great misconception here. It's called the information deficit fallacy. Many people think that all we need is more data. All we need is better information. All we need is better education. But look at the record of the last 50 years. We have had more education, more science, more data than ever before in history, all telling the same story, that Overshoot is getting worse. So if you just go back to 1990, we've had 28 COP conferences on climate change. There's been something like 6 formal agreements. We've seen 30-odd conferences on climate in addition to COP. In 1992, we had the first scientists' warning to humanity, which outlined exactly what would happen if we carried on the present path. If you go back even further to Limits to Growth, the Club of Rome publication from 1972, it projected exactly what we're seeing happening, and that there'd be a peak in pollution and population and then a crash later on in this present century. Well, here's my point. We've had 50 years of improving technology, of better education, of improved scientific data, of countless reports to governments on the dangers of the situation. And yet during that entire time, 28 conferences to reduce carbon emissions, And we've doubled our carbon emissions in that period of time. And it's still increasing at an exponential rate, despite the onset of this so far trivial, renewable energy transmission. So more education and better data don't make any difference. If people are unprepared to understand and analyze and utilize those data in ways that are consistent with the implications of those data. So, no, more information is not the solution. We've got enough information. What we don't have is the cognitive capacity to recognize the situation as serious as it is. In fact, we have a generally ignorant population, and therefore no political will. Political will comes, at least in democracies, from the people. And as long as politicians are being persuaded by the corporate sector, which has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, then nothing will happen. Because the people will remain in ignorance, the politicians pay attention to their corporate donors, and off we go. And I'm rattling on, but this is really the crux of the matter. If you look at even the COP conferences, they're dominated not by climate scientists, but by political advisors and corporate sector executives. So we have a situation in which all of the acceptable solutions to just one symptom of overshoot, climate change, involve massive capital investment. We're promised enormous job creation, the huge opportunities for profit making, and so on and so forth. So several ecological economists have argued, Clive Spash among them, a very prominent British economist, that the whole system is set up to make capitalism seem to be the solution to the problem rather than its cause. So we're trying to solve the problem by doing exactly what we've done to create the problem, which is massive investment, more growth, more use of materials and energy, and so on and so forth. So we're caught in this perpetual loop of self-destruction and seemingly unable to break out of it, in spite of the accumulating evidence that we're in a spiral, a downward spiral.
Yes, I agree with you. We are in a kind of Jevons paradox. The more we need to scale down, the more we actually scale up.
Exactly. As a solution. And by the way, anyway, yeah, and that's what Einstein said, and others have said the same thing, that you cannot solve a problem at
with
the same
mindset
that created it. And yet that's what we do over and over and over again.
Here in Europe, we see alternative movements getting created. Some weeks ago, I was hosting Roger Hallam, one of the who created Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, real grassroots movements that are attracting people. He spent several months in prison for his beliefs and for his actions. I know, Roger. He's quite passionate. He's providing a different way to doing politics, to scaling down the economy. What I'm not sure is within our societies and with the established interests that you already mentioned, I'm not sure if this kind of movements are going to create better chances for our future, or if they are going to actually destroy our chances because they are going to create more conflict. And right now we need more common agreements, more common understandings. Conflictual policies, I'm not so sure that they are going to provide the solutions. We are not back in the 19th century where the Marxists were marching and they were actually asking for a political say. Right now, the time window is closing, and it is closing fast. That's where my question mark is. If not, I would go all the way with Roger.
No, I agree with you. We have a situation where conflict is inevitable. I think that's always been the way with human beings. I will, for a moment, just let me be a little bit depressing. Some problems are not solvable. Some problems are not solvable. And it may well be that we've put ourselves into such a trap here that this is not a problem that is solvable in the short term that we have left. I've developed a notion, not everybody agrees, but that the human brain evolved in very simple times. It reached its maximum size and capacity 500,000 years ago. So even the modern brain is smaller than that one. But my point is that when the human brain evolved, we lived in very simple circumstances. Very few people. You'd only meet a couple of dozen people or 100 in your whole life. You lived in a constrained environment, a small area. You probably lived and died within a few kilometers of the same place. So the social and ecological environments in which the human brain developed 500,000 years ago was relatively simple and did not impose much challenge to the human brain. So we're still stuck with that same brain. So we are naturally inclined to think simplistically, one problem at a time. So it's climate change, or it's the pandemic, or it's the war in Ukraine. But we never connect all the dots and realize that these things, climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, tropical deforestation, all of these things are symptoms of the same meta problem called overshoot. So the human brain, by being so narrow and singularly focused, is simply incapable of encompassing the full complexity of the world that we have created. So when you compare today's world, where no one person can understand the economy or the internet or global politics or the climate system or any of these things, let alone the combined interaction of all of those things, we have a huge conundrum. It's simply that we have created a world, cultural evolution has so outpaced biological evolution that the state of the world we have created is vastly more complex than our primitive brains are capable of grasping. So we're really in a situation where we can't even understand the problem, let alone pose solutions that are capable of addressing it. And when I really think this through, this is where I get depressed, because I really do think this is one of those unsolvable problems that will simply have to resolve itself. Nature will take its revenge. Human beings, I mentioned earlier that we operate out of our made-up stories. Well, one of our made-up stories in the intellectual history of the Enlightenment is that humans are exceptional. We're not part of nature. So human exceptionalism extracts humans and the economy from nature and separates these two systems. It believes that human behavior is entirely a product of social and cultural norms that have nothing to do with biology, and that the greatest resource is nothing in nature, it's the human mind, so that technology can solve all of our problems. So if you believe that the human economy is separate from the environment, if you believe that technology can solve all of our problems, and that's really what our culture believes, then you have a recipe for infinite growth. But the reality is that we're on a finite planet, that the economy is a subsystem of nature, and all of our beliefs are completely in defiance of that reality. And so we're bound to have a huge conflict.
Yes,
so I think
I agree with you. I believe that we have lost the balance with nature. We divorced ourselves from nature and from our own very nature.
Absolutely.
The ancient Greeks used to have an adage saying that if you want to understand a human, you need to observe the humans. But if you need to understand the humans, you need to observe the animals.
Yeah.
We have lost this connection. We have lost our ecological basis, the ecological basis of our existence into nature. We are part of nature while we think ourselves quite separated, divorced from it.
That's exactly my point. So the way we think is so different from reality that it can't solve our real problems.
And right now we are also creating virtual realities within which we dive, and we are getting further away from the real world. I'm a pretty grounded person. I like to go running. I have olive trees to cultivate my land. I love, but I see right now in the new generation that they don't even care to come from my nieces and nephews that are 10, 12 years old. They don't scared to come to the nature because the artificial environment, the screen, is so much more attractive. And having studied the human brain, I see the human brain absorbs something like 1,100 bits per second of information per second, while the screen is shooting us with 4,000 bits per second.
Yeah.
This is addictive.
Of course.
This creates an addiction. And so the more you sit to the screen, the more you need the screen. And this is a loop.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good science now coming out to show the detrimental effects of screen time. That people are spending far too much time on screens. And just as you say, it helps to create the synaptic circuits in the brain, which block out alternative perceptions of reality. So again, we've got a major problem here. And we also, Alexandros, we don't pay much attention to our own history as a species. Every other major civilization has gone through a similar pattern of growth, development, innovation, enormous plasticity and resilience, and then it starts to mature. It matures and gets rigid, and equity disappears, politics becomes corrupt, too many, anyway, you get the point. Then it crumbles and it collapses. But we're on exactly the same path. So there's a dozen books out to describe what this story looks like. And our civilization, so-called techno-industrial, I call it modern techno-industrial civilization, is following precisely the same path. We had a glorious period in the middle part of the 20th century, but we've now reached the late capitalist mature phase where there's political corruption, divisiveness, breakdown in social order, increasing discontent, people no longer having confidence in governments, and so on and so forth. These are all the socio-cultural symptoms of incipient collapse. Meanwhile, the environment is being pulled out from under us. We're seeing climate change, plunging biodiversity, ocean acidification, all of these manifestations of the excessive scale of the human enterprise. So either we address these two realities, our cultural rigidity and incompetence to deal even with, who can manage a city these days, let alone the whole world. And the other half is the environmental, the biophysical environmental situation. So we have two major co-crises, each comprising dozens of smaller crises, in the metacrisis of Overshoot. Some people call it the poly crisis. I don't like that term because poly means many separate things, whereas meta means one cause of all of these things. And I believe there is one cause of all of these major problems, and it is the fundamental predisposition of the human enterprise to expand and to consume all resources. That's a natural human tendency. Every other animal shares it, but we have created a cultural paradigm, a mindset which reinforces this biological tendency to expand and consume everything. So we're in the worst of all possible worlds. We're an animal with natural survival instincts to expand and consume resources, and we have a cultural model which encourages us to grow indefinitely and to think that there are no consequences. But there is a phenomenon called carrying capacity. So humans have exceeded the carrying capacity of the Earth for themselves. That's Overshoot, and the Earth will get its revenge.
You have taught to esteemed universities for quite several decades.
Yes.
I'm sure that you have people, ex-students of yours, being in positions of power, being politicians, being in big companies, in global institutions. What is the feedback that you are getting from them about these problems?
Many of my former students, some write me. I probably get a letter every month or so from someone I haven't heard from for years saying, I had doubts about some of the things you were teaching us back in 1980 or 1990, but it's all unhappening before my eyes. But I can't convince my colleagues. I'm in an environment which is not receptive, even now, to these ideas. Or they accept that these things are happening, but we will solve the problem. For example, the alternative energy revolution is upon us and will save the day. So generally speaking, not everywhere, but generally speaking, there's very little receptivity to the, I suppose, gigantic scale of the problems confronting us. People again tend to think in isolated little bits of, oh, we can solve the energy, oh, we can solve the pandemic, oh, we can solve the biodiversity crisis. All we have to do is throw iron filings in the oceans and that will solve all of that. So we do not tend to see the big picture. And because students of mine do see the big picture, they seem to make very little headway in their current environments to moving this forward. We still seem stuck. Yeah, look, I know Roger Hallam. I don't know him personally, but we've corresponded. I've written one article in support of much of what he says in the extinction movement. But these are fringe movements, right? They're on the edge. Even degrowth, which has an enormous following in Europe, is still major in terms of major movements on the fringes of society. I hope in the next few years that they will begin to break through into mainstream organizations such as the European Commission. There's no hope in North America. If Trump gets reelected, the Americans are finished, and Canada is not far behind because we're so closely tied to the United States. I mean, finished in terms of addressing these issues, at least in the short term. So, as I said, we seem to be in a culture that instead of pulling together and recognizing that this is a collective problem that requires collective solutions and an unprecedented level of international cooperation, instead, we see the symptoms of late decay occurring, a breakdown in international relationships, increasingly disparate perspectives politically on every level, a breakdown in internal communications, exacerbated by AI, because now we have deep fake news and all sorts of other crazy ways of disturbing the truth. Nobody knows what the truth is anymore.
Yes, we live in a post-truth environment.
Post-truth, that was the word, 2015, post-truth was the word of the the word of the year.
I have published a peer-reviewed article back then on the post-truth democracy.
Okay, so all of this, you see, obfuscates, confuses. There's no sense of unity. We have no common ground upon which we stand. Everyone is creating his own little special story on the internet. There's thousands of channels, each with a slightly different variation on the theme. So instead of a sense of growing community, instead of a sense of cooperative indulgence in solving this problem, we see, I see at least, an increasingly disparate, dissipating human community in a world that really requires completely the opposite to what we are doing.
Professor, do you have grandchildren?
I don't.
You don't. Okay, but let's talk about the grandchildren of other people. What would you advise to people coming of age right now, being 15, teenagers, going to 18? What is your advice to them? Because I believe that, yes, all past generations that have already formed their mindsets, their brain capacities, and they have already developed their prefrontal cortex, actually, the decision-making center of the brain, are doomed. We are not going to change. Maybe we are going to recognize the problem, but it's become very difficult for us to change our habits. Mm-hmm. But if we have a hope, that is in the new generation, the children of today that are going to become the next people of the world. What is your advice to them?
Well, again, it's a huge question. You've mentioned that older generations are already lost. And we're already lost because we've been steeped in a culture that has a set of beliefs, values, and assumptions that have brought us to the present state. Those younger people need to have a different cultural environment than the ones in which they have grown. Instead of thinking of human separation from nature, instead of belief that the economy is not connected to the natural world, what if we had an education system that started at the earliest level, and we would call it a kindergarten in North America, which taught young people that they were an intimate component of their local ecosystems and that they had to tread very carefully and to protect nature at every stage, that their level of consumption could not exceed the level of production by nature, and so on. So I would advise young people to very carefully study the beliefs, values, and assumptions that have brought the modern techno-industrial world to this brink of collapse, and to substitute those with the opposites. So instead of separation, think of unity. Instead of consuming excessively, it's a question of consuming just enough to maintain the ecological integrity of the systems that support us. Instead of unlimited growth, think of the rate of growth that is compatible, not rate of growth, the scale of the community that is compatible with the productivity and assimilative capacities of local ecosystems. So it's a completely different mindset from the mindset that you and I have grown up with. And I'm afraid by the time a young person has reached 15 or 16, they've already acquired the beliefs of their parents and so on. Oh, young people, some today don't want an automobile or whatever, but they have their computers and their cell phones and a whole variety of other things, which are simply substitutes for the same thing. So I guess what I'm really saying is, unless we have an education system from the ground up, from kindergarten right through university, that is based on an entirely different set of beliefs, values, assumptions, social norms, and behaviors, we're not going to break through this conundrum. So we're really talking, Alexandros, about what I call a civilizational, a personal to civilizational transformation of the fundamental philosophical underpinnings of the culture in which we live. So
this is the what. Now we have to understand and come up with the how.
Well, that's what I said. You have to go right back. How do you convince the present system to implement its opposite? That's the question of the day. How do we convince the present dominant paradigm, if you want to use the technical term, to recreate a new system, which is the opposite of what it is? And I don't know if that's a possible endeavor.
Well,
that's why
the economists, they have introduced this notion of creative distraction in the economy. But unfortunately, when it comes to societies, creative distraction happens. We don't choose to impose it on ourselves. Empires come and go, big organizations, states come and go, species come and go. And this is the very idea that we should always have in mind, because we are a species.
Of course we are.
And we're quite young. We're very young in nature.
Yeah, I think you're right. But you see, most people deny that we are a species like the others. It goes back to something we talked about earlier, human exceptionalism. We're not like the others. We're separate. I believe we're not. We're exactly like the others. We're compelled or propelled by the same instinctive, urges and predispositions, and we will follow the same path. You've already said it. Empires come and go. Well, we are in a civilization that will come. It has come, and it will go. The question is, how do we even imagine what will remain in its path? Because all of the primary energy will have been used up. The best deposits of minerals and ores will have been used up. So it's going to be very difficult to develop a follow-up civilization if we destroy this one, particularly if we destroy it through some massive conflagration like a nuclear war, which seems increasingly possible, if not likely, at the present time. So, I think we're in desperate straits, and that it's time.
We're heading to a bottleneck. Maybe a great filter, as the bioscientists are saying. This is talking about civilization, especially planetary civilizations, and this Fermi paradox. Where is everybody? Maybe there is a great filter ahead.
I don't think we'll render ourselves extinct.
No, I don't think so. Also, I think that there are going to be pockets surviving, but I do believe that there is a great pruning coming.
Oh, absolutely. I wrote a paper in which I called a population correction an inevitability. And again, it's just every other species goes through a boom and a bust, a boom and a bust. When resources are plentiful, when the environment is healthy, when the climate is conducive to long life, then species explode. But then things change and they crash. It's a balance between what's called positive feedback and negative feedback. So our natural predisposition for population growth, economic growth, is positive feedback. It's every increment adds to the principle, as it were, and it continues to grow. But at some point, negative feedback sets in: disease, resource shortages, food shortages, war, and that slams the population back. It happens to other species. It will happen. Well, it has happened many, many times in previous civilizations, and there's no reason to think that our modern civilization is any different. It differs in one respect. Whereas the Roman civilization or the Mesopotamian civilization or the Chinese or whatever collapsed locally or regionally, we now have a global civilization, so intricately interconnected through trade and the internet and global economies, that if one major component goes down, the whole system goes down. So we have, I think, a unique situation in human history where we've occupied the entire planet. We have the essence of a global civilization. Not everybody participates, but it is of such that those of us in high income industrialized countries are so mutually interdependent that the collapse of any major component means the collapse of it all. It's amazing to me that countries like those in Europe or North America have offloaded so much of their manufacturing to India and China and parts of we're utterly dependent on them. Most of the important computer chips are made were in Taiwan. If that gets cut off, then what happens to it's just insane. This degree of interconnectedness in a very politically unstable circumstance is really a version of insanity. We should be looking toward more localization of production of essential items so that those pockets of survival will have the capacity to make their own clothes, make their own cloth, make their own shoes, and do the basic things of growing their own food and so on necessary for survival. But right now, most countries are so specialized that they've lost the capacity to comprehensively tend to themselves were they cut off from the rest of the world. Another thing, trade. I've often argued that globalization and trade is the most ecologically destructive thing that's ever happened, because we now have a situation where 80% of the world's people are dependent on the importation of foodstuffs from other countries. And so if global trade networks are cut off, those people are left high and dry. A few countries have surpluses, but only a very few countries. And they're now providing for the deficits in other countries. So we speak of ecological surpluses and ecological deficits. Most countries in Europe are running a huge ecological deficit. A few years ago, we showed that Europe, the European community, is using a productive land area 3 times larger than the domestic land area of Europe, the productive land of Europe. Well, that's all acquired through trade. So with the collapse of the global trading system, of the global economy, Europe is going to be in a very, very different circumstance. People like in the Netherlands delude themselves. I mean, I have seen papers describing how the Netherlands is a model for the world to follow because it's an extremely densely populated country, yet is self-sufficient in food. That's nonsense. The Netherlands has to import huge quantities of fodder to feed its animal and domestic fowl populations, which produce the food. But that's really food grown elsewhere, right? So they export cheese and processed meat, which is a high value added component. So if you look at the economy, yeah, the Netherlands may be close to self-sufficient in food because they import very cheap fodder to create very expensive exports. So the trade balance in money terms is equal, but the trade balance in land terms is absurdly not equal. Holland uses several times as much land in other countries to grow its food through this trade complex
But
than is available.
unfortunately, we live on one and only planet. We don't
That's
have
right.
a second and a third Earth.
And we're not going to trade with other planets. That's for very sure. Anyway, that's my summary. I think we've got an enormous problem. Almost everything we're doing is making it worse. And most of the world has yet to wake up to the reality of the meta problem of overshoot. And until we do, it's not even possible to think of solutions. And even the solutions we think of tend to be, this is what we should do. But very few people think of how do we get governments and ordinary people and institutions and corporations to actually do the things we should be doing to solve the problem that we've created for ourselves.
You live in a country, Canada, that has the reputation of being quite logical, quite well, of finding solutions. But last year, you have had these huge fires. What are the solutions that your government is proposing right now to come up with concrete ideas, to come up with concrete policies to address this problem of the mega fires that are happening in your forests that are a big lung of the planet?
Yeah, the fires are creating vastly more carbon emissions than the whole economy of the country. So we have a huge dilemma. And frankly, we can't do anything about it. The forests are huge. We're putting vastly more money into fire prevention, or at least suppression, but it's insufficient. Meanwhile, you see, we have a government in Ottawa that has been taken over by corporate ideas, the idea that we need 100 million people in Canada. So there's an organization out of Ottawa called, what is it called? The Century Project. And the Trudeau government believe in this. So in order to maintain Canada's position in the world, we have to grow the population and grow the economy. So last year, we increased the Canadian population by 1 million people out of 40. So that's over to 2.5% or something. It's the highest population growth rate of any OECD country. This, to my mind, is insane. And yet that's where our government's going. We have huge conflicts within the country because a couple of provinces, Saskatchewan and Alberta particularly, are very much dependent on oil and natural gas development. So Ottawa is torn between trying to reduce its carbon emissions for the nation as a whole without offending the politically necessary votes that it gets out of Alberta and Saskatchewan. So there's enormous political tensions in the country. The Premier of Alberta is absolutely hostile to the government in Ottawa because she sees it as attacking the primary industrial base of the province of Alberta. So Canada may have a reputation, but we're suffering from all of the same problems, and it's causing enormous dissent within the country and great tensions on the political level. So we're not moving forward very rapidly at all. And in fact, a friend of mine has recently done an analysis of the government's carbon emissions reductions plan to show that it's an impossible fantasy, like so much else we've been talking about. We like to create these fantasies, and then we live as if the fantasies were true, ignoring the reality that is unfolding around us. So Canada has enormous opportunities and enormous possibilities, and far more resilience, even ecologically, than most other countries, but we're blowing it. Right now, we're not really addressing the issues. We are the cause of our own problems.
Doctor, I don't want to abuse your time. I want to thank you very much for this interesting discussion. Whenever you publish one new paper, I'm sure that you are going to publish one new paper again soon. I would like to have it discussed here again in the history of the Metacrisis. I think that your message should be transmitted wide and large.
Well, thank you very much, Alexandros. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you again, hopefully.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.